Hi, everybody. Welcome back to World History. We're rolling into our next section of notes today, so go ahead and get your notes out and let's get started. So today we're talking about the beginnings of civilization. Mostly what we're going to be focusing on are the basic traits that we associate with each civilization. What are like the main characteristics that each one needs to have in order to be a functioning civilization in the terms that we use in history. So here are some of the basic features of civilization that we look for in most ancient civilizations. Now, we'll go into each one of these in the next couple of minutes, go over each one of them, and explain them a little bit more. But just to give you a basic rundown of what is necessary, we have cities, organized governments, complex religions, job specialization, social classes, art and architecture, public works, and writing. These are the basic features that we as historians associate with every single civilization. In order to meet the term civilization, it must check all of these boxes. So we're going to run through each trait individually, talk about them briefly. Cities, these are population centers, larger and more organized than towns or villages, and support other features, whether that be more like a base of government or those sorts of things. Now, we know what a city is. We currently live in you could almost say a city. In the state of Missouri, if we were to focus on Missouri specifically, if you were to think of, well, what would be a city that we could use to define in terms of a civilization? Probably the ideas of like Springfield and St. Louis and Kansas City probably come to mind as ones you would think would qualify as a city under this definition. Now, if you look at the slide, I'm going to talk about the pictures briefly. These ones over here, these are from a bunch of ancient civilizations that we'll talk about over the next couple of weeks. And then, of course, if you know your U.S. cities, this is San Francisco, one of the most modern cities in the United States currently. Now, just as much as a city is important to civilization, water is just as important. We need that to live. Without it, we can't survive. It's good for farming, drinking, cleaning, fishing, transportation, and hunting, because all living things need water. Now, the results of this, it created surpluses, so more food than necessary, that would then be stored for the future, whether that being preserved or cooked in a way that it would last a long time. Populations could grow, and first cities appeared. A lot of early cities that we'll be focusing on are based around rivers. And then this is where we start to see a very simple traditional economy, which relies on habit, custom, or ritual, and little to no change over time. A traditional economy, to talk about that for a second, is an economic system in which the method that goods and services are traded essentially is like a barter system. You're not using money to pay for it. Unlike today, where if you go to Walmart and you want to buy a 12-pack of pop, you need to pay with cash or a debit card. Back then, let's say you wanted to get some goat's milk to make cheese. You may trade 2 loaves of bread for a quart of goat's milk. It was a barter system in which everybody just simply traded what they needed for what they had for something else that they needed. So, the world's first. We'll talk a lot more about these civilizations in the coming weeks. These are the main ones that we'll be focusing on. Civilizations were a complex, highly organized social order. We are in a civilization today, what we call the modern age civilization. Now, the major river valleys that we're going to be focusing on are Sumer, which is at the cross-section of the Tigris and Euphrates River, which you may or may not, if I don't remember correctly, have learned on that map practice that I gave you. Of course, Egypt with the Nile River, Indus or India with the Indus River, and then the Shang and the Huang Yellow River in China. We'll talk a lot more about those in the coming weeks. So other traits of civilization. Organized government. They need to be there to coordinate large-scale projects such as food production, construction, laws, and defense. Those are the major tenets that a government would be in charge of, and it is necessary for them to be there in order to function as a civilization. Another big thing is complex religions. Now, this is a system of religious beliefs that usually include rituals and worship one or more gods and goddesses. Now, most of the major religions that still exist today, namely things like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, They all worship one singular god. Whereas you have other religions, such as Hinduism, that believe in more than one god, and that being polytheistic, the belief that there is more than one god or goddess. Now, one thing to note before we get into any of those civilizations is we were going to talk a lot about polytheistic religions and as they relate to ancient civilizations, mainly because it gives us a really good aspect into their culture, their traditions, and how they did things. Because a lot of times people's decisions are guided by their moral beliefs, and sometimes those beliefs come from their religions. All right, some more traits that we need to talk about. We have job specialization. This is a system in which there are different types of jobs, and each worker focuses on one particular type. So, like artisans or skilled craftspeople, it's not like you are going out and doing everything. You are doing one specific thing. You only have that one job. So, an example would be, let's say, well, I'm a teacher. My only job is to teach. I'm not expected to go out into a field and tend to crops. It's my job to be in a classroom teaching you. We also have social classes. Now, these are ranked groups within society that are determined by job or economic standing. We'll talk a lot more about the effect of social classes on ancient civilizations in the coming weeks. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Uh, Arts and architecture. These are various types of artwork and buildings that express the talents, beliefs, and values of a people in a society. We will talk a lot about that as well, along with public works or large-scale and often costly projects that benefit the city and its people. Examples could include the pyramids in Egypt and the Great Wall of China. We'll talk a lot more about those in the coming weeks. Now, to me, one of the biggest things of traits of civilization that is probably one of the most important is that of writing. These are structured writing systems used initially by the governments or religious leaders to record important information. Now, there are two main ways in the ancient world that we talk about them writing. We have pictographs, or simple drawings that look like the objects they represent. So that would be like this first image over here. And then we have other writing examples like this one here, which I believe is Chinese, which is an actual written language. And a lot of times in these ancient civilizations, they had what was known as a scribe, a trained person who could read and write and kept records. Now, that usually led into a lot of issues because more often than not, the position of scribe was for the most part reserved only for the highest of the upper classes of society, mainly because education wasn't free and accessible to everybody in the ancient world. More often than not, if you were going to get an education, your family tended to be pretty rich because they had to pay for it. So these civilizations did change a lot over time, which is true of anything. Things change, whether that be of an external conflict, a change in the environment, any of those things. But one of the biggest things that we see in terms of the ancient world is the spreading of different cultures around what we now know today as the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. So if you look at this image here, you can see these are trade routes from everywhere and going to different places all over the Middle East and Asia. Now, when you traveled back then, you not only were going to a new place, it was also your opportunity to share your culture with another one and learn about another culture. More often than not, traders that went from one region to another would typically pick up a lot of the local culture while they are there, whether that be the food, spices, clothing items, or anything unique to that region of the world. It's why, when we talk about it, India and China are most famous for spices and silk, respectively. Those two things were viewed as monumental and luxury items all over here. Whereas in India and China, spices and silk were normal. That was the basic thing. They always had it. But more often than not, we saw what was known as cultural diffusion, which is the spreading of ideas and customs from one group to another in other parts of the world. This typically mostly happened during trade, but also could occur during migrations and or war. We'll talk a lot more about how various civilizations have influenced each other in the coming weeks. Again, we got to talk about government. That one's important too. We have what rises to be city-states or political units that include a city and its surrounding land and villages. We'll talk a lot more about the idea of city-states in Unit 2 when we get to ancient Greece, because they really popularized the idea of city-states. And then empires, which are groups of states or territories controlled by one ruler. We'll talk a lot about empires this unit, next unit, and in Unit 3 when we get to ancient Rome, because they did a lot with the empires. All right, that is it for notes for today. I will see you all next time. Bye, everyone.